Hey, this is Patrick, and this is my next video on deploying Q-Sys at scale. Now we can see how the code is going to work with the config, and we're going to upload the config separately. I can change the names and I can change the visibility of faders based on what the config file does. So if I rename it, it changes to rename. If I change it to mic, if I add more faders, it makes them visible, and so on and so forth. So this is how it's going to work. The parent core is going to distribute code to the server core, but it's also going to distribute configuration files to all the other cores. So the server is distributing the code, and the computer is distributing config files to all of them downstream. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to open a new folder, and we're going to open a terminal at that folder. From there, we're going to initialize npm. We're going to go through some of the prompts that it gives us before we initialize. Now, I prefer to use ES6 versus CommonJS, so I'm going to change the type to module. We're going to create some folders at the root, sources for the helper code, and configs are for the config files. We're also going to create some files at the root, .env, app.js, and our .getignore. Then we are going to authenticate our core, both in the core manager as well as in the administrator for the QRC API. This is going to harden our core against vulnerabilities as well as keep our information security team happy. Those credentials are going to be passed into our .env file. And then we're going to create our Node.js helper files, config, media API, and index. We will then add some dependencies. .env is for secrets, Axios is for REST APIs, form data is for uploading data, ID Q-Sys I made out of the first video, and NodeMon I explained in the first video. Config.js is what I usually use for authentication. I either just pass the passwords through there, or I use the passwords to create an API token with an Axios post request. So I'm going to go ahead and create an object called creds, is where I pass in all of those credentials that I created a second ago. If I were to print out this creds body, I would see all of the credentials. Here's a snippet of the media API documentation that shows you how to create a token with a post request. Here's a snippet out of Axios that shows you how to make and format a post request. If I were to print that token at the IP address of my core, I would see the API key right there. Now let's go ahead and export that as well as the credentials. Here are some snippets of the documentation for the various libraries that I'm going to be using. We will also go ahead and import that token. That is the function that uses the post request to create the token. Now let's go ahead and write our first function. It is going to use the list directory API call, and it's going to look for a folder that we input and see if it's already loaded on the core. If the folder does exist, it's going to return true, but if it does not exist, it's going to return false. The next function we're going to write is how to create a folder. So it's going to use the create folder API call, and it's going to create a folder that we input at the given IP address. The next function will be to upload data to the core. So it's going to take the IP address, the folder we're uploading to, and then it's going to point to the file with the FS library in Node.js. We are also using that form data dependency to format and upload our multi-part form encoded data to the core. The last function on this page is going to combine all three of those functions that we created, and I've called it media main. It's going to check for a folder. If it doesn't have the folder, it's going to create a new one. And either way, after it creates a new one, or whether it already sees it there, it's going to upload data to the folder that we point at. We are combining several asynchronous functions here, so we're going to use Node.js's promise.all constructor to make sure that we are waiting until creating or checking the folder are complete before we upload data to that core. So once all those promises have been resolved, we're going to go ahead and upload the data. We can now go ahead and run that function and test and see if it works. You can see in the logs that it did successfully upload the data, and then you can also see on the web page of the core that it did add the configs folder. Let's move over to index.js. That's kind of our main script handler. You can also see that I took the content of the first video and I created my own NPM library out of it. So we're going to go ahead and import some dependencies, a few pieces of code from Node's file stream library, as well as the media main function that we wrote in the previous script. We're also going to import our credentials from our config.js, and we'll get started writing. The first function is going to create a list of the titles of our config files from the config folder. This is going to use a function called read directory from Node's fs promises library. We're eventually going to take those titles and open a file stream at each one of the titles. We're going to turn that into JSON, and we're going to start parsing data out of those config files to tell the script how to deploy this properly. If we create two dummy JSON files, we can list them with the read directory and see that it works. We can now get started on our main handler, which we will call main. We will start on that getConfigs function, but you can see that I deleted those two dummy JSON files. So let's go ahead and create the real ones. So what we're going to do is name them the exact same name as the design name on each core, and then we're going to programmatically parse those out. If we deploy what we just wrote from the parent core to the client core, we will get the names printed out in the logs. So now we're going to convert those Lua tables that were the previous state objects and turn those into JSON and then put them in the config file in our script. I used Q-Sys' rapid JSON to convert the Lua table to JSON, and then I found a JSON formatter that formatted it properly for me. Now we're going to use our script to start parsing through that JSON. You can see here that we're using file streams read file sync function along with the read directory function that we already created. And then we're going to parse that back into JSON. We're then going to use the IDE Q-Sys module that I created to go ahead and change the deploy, not deploy buttons to not deploy before we push any new code. We're going to add some more information to the configuration files that are going to help guide the deployment, including the IP address of each core and the component name of each deploy off button that we're going to be setting programmatically. But before I do that, why don't I go ahead and comment out that IDE Q-Sys part and just print the config files, and you can see that they're now printing in the logs. We're going to go ahead and iterate through that deployment section that I created on each core, just like this. My IDE Q-Sys module is going to use the component name for the off button for each of the different pieces of code, and it's going to turn those off before we deploy anything. Note these optional arguments in my NPM package. Originally I had written this just to deploy code, but then I realized you also want to alter components sometimes. So if you change the type away from code, it will alter that component type. You can now see in the design files that once I run this code, those deploy buttons will switch to off. So let's go ahead and test out this media main function. We're going to check for a folder and create the file and the folder if need be as well. You can see that it says it created, and you can see in the config section that it did create those files. So we've done everything we need to do in index.js. Now we're going to go ahead and export all that. Because app.js lives on one folder above index.js, a few of the directories need to be changed where they're pointing towards. We can go ahead and export our main handler into app.js, and all app.js is going to do is run main. So we're going to try and run it. You see that I needed to move up a directory, and now we run it again, and you can see that it ran successfully. Now we can see that we had removed our state object, and the script is still looking for that st object. So we need to use the io.read module to go ahead and read that. If you recall, I used the design.getStatus to get the design name of each file, and that's what I titled the JSON file. So we're going to go ahead and import that and convert it with json.decode back into Lua, and then we will close the file stream. You can see that the script is no longer registering an error for not having the st object, and if we JSON encode that decoded file, we will see the config file in the logs. Now you can see the power and flexibility of being able to change that configuration file, upload it, restart the same script, and see the text that we just changed change. This is the next step in spinning up a full build, configure, and deploy environment for Q-Sys, but it is the end of this video. We will explore these topics further in a future video. Thank you for joining.